Hello, and welcome to the inaugural podcast of Confessions of a Gen X Activist, of a Radical Activist. True Crime Stories. I don't know, I'm just making it up. I don't have a working title for this yet, but it is going to be a history of activism as told through my own experience. I'm Kelly Green. Some of you may know me, some of you may not know me. So those who don't yet, thanks. Welcome to the podcast. Hope you're able to stay tuned through the series. We're going to have a lot of fun. We're going to be spanning years from, say, around 1990 to present day. So we got a lot of ground to cover. And the inspiration for this podcast came from my son, Maxwell. Last summer, we were camping down in Drumheller, sitting around the campfire one night, just talking. And I was recounting a story how I was in an activist meeting. It was an after-event meeting, I guess like a debrief. And one of the principals of this meeting during a breakout had accosted me, physically assaulted me, and then threatened my life, which was quite frightening. So I want to tell you that story, but not right now. That's kind of later on down the line. I want to first start with just explaining that I got into activism, I guess, as a reason to find meaning in my life, or something that meant something, right? Not just have a life that was boring and useless and didn't do anything. I needed to feel something. So let's see, taking it back. 1990, where was I? Well, I was just coming out of a career in sales. Fresh out of high school, I had started a job as a door-to-door vacuum cleaner salesman, of all things. Very inglorious, very much a shunned-upon job. But I learned a lot. It was an excellent learning experience, meeting people, traveling around the different small towns and cities throughout Alberta and BC. It was excellent. Made some good money. Had a lot of times where I wasn't making any money. 100% commission job. This was, near the end of the 1980s, early 1990s. It was kind of the time like capitalism had won, I guess, the Cold War. The Berlin Wall had come down recently. Culturally, it just seemed like, the predominant saying was, whoever dies with the most toys wins. So it seemed like making money was about the best thing a person could do in life. And I guess part of the appeal of going into sales was that I could short circuit maybe the regular career path of trying to work for 40, 50 years and scrape together enough money to pay for a house and have retirement, et cetera, et cetera. And through sales, there was a promise of getting there very quickly. However, that dream didn't last that long. Essentially, after about 2 years, when I got myself into a position of ownership where I started making a lot of money compared to the people that were working under me, it had occurred to me that this wasn't a very morally sound situation. I did mind being at the bottom of the ladder myself, knowing that someday I would climb that ladder. But once I was in a position to earn off other people's hard work, watching them struggle, while I was now making 5 figures a month, that didn't sit right with me. Also along that time, certain things were starting to creep in culturally through the news for environmentalism. Like I said, it was the end of the 1980s, early 1990s. There was a lot of stuff going on in the news throughout the 80s. Acid rain, ozone depletion, the ozone hole, how we had come together internationally through the Montreal Protocol to do away with the chemicals that were harming the ozone layer. There was a lot of that stuff going on in the background, and I guess it was just coincidental. I was ripe for change near the end of my career in sales. I had met a girl. It's always a girl. I met this girl who'd lit up my life. It's first time seeing her, it just seemed like my entire life changed, my perspective changed on everything. I couldn't put my finger on it at the time or any reason why, but it just was. We got together, we fell in love. I ended up ditching that job, and we traveled together out to Toronto from Edmonton, where her family was, and spent the summer out there. I took on a job selling light bulbs. Of all things. It was very strange. And started dreaming about, how can how can I have a career? How can I have a job that's going to have more meaning, not just selling, a cleaning product or a light bulb, right? I didn't have that strong of an education background yet, and I needed something to really gel, really take off. So about that time, it's spring of 1990, I went to my first Earth Day festival, Earth Day activity. This would have been, that's close to the 20th anniversary of Earth Day. And it took place, this particular gathering was at Queen's Park, the provincial legislature grounds in downtown Toronto. And, let's see, I got to learn about a lot of different environmental issues that I hadn't heard about before. The danger of chemicals in our environment from the bleaching of paper, for example. The danger of chemicals getting into our body in contact with certain consumer products. Deforestation. I think I might have learned about global warming for the first time. A lot of these issues were sort of coming to the fore, and it was both concerning. I'm thinking, well, I didn't know that things were as bad as they were, and very interesting, very enlightening. During that first Earth Day, I had an opportunity to meet David Suzuki. He was on hand. I think he was doing some book signings. And that was quite excellent because I guess, like many Canadians, my first foray into an understanding of the natural world came through the TV, ironically enough, by David Suzuki, who was the host of The Nature of Things. Many of you know that. I'm sure that all of you know that. At that time, I also met my first Greenpeace activist. Now, I'd heard of Greenpeace before, more kind of in a derisive state, but I knew that they were all about saving the whales, so at least I had an understanding. And I think I had an understanding that they were also against nukes and against weapons and that type of thing, because during my youth there was a slight uprising of opposition against long-range missile testing, weapons testing at Cold Lake Air Weapons Range in Alberta, Straddles, Alberta, Saskatchewan. And there was a little bit of an uproar about that, although I was too young to both understand or take part when that was going on in the early 1980s. So around that time as well, one direct, I guess, activism, volunteer sort of involvement thing that I did. So I got involved with the World Wildlife Fund on a fundraiser for their organization to climb the CN Tower, which, as I'm sure you know, is very tall. There's like 120 stories of steps. It was a lot. You'd have to check the exact numbers on that. It took 22 minutes to climb all those stairs. I think the record is 9 minutes. I did it in 22. In subsequent years, I climbed it in 20 and then 19 minutes. So it was enjoyable enough that I went back to do it a couple more times. And it gave me a taste of getting involved and trying to help out an environmental organization that are working on bigger issues and trying to plug in on how I could make that happen. So I guess that was my first foray. I'm like 19 years old. Hadn't really fully gelled with all my ideas and all my experiences yet, and what I wanted to be and do. So after a while in Toronto, that wasn't panning out. I made my way back to Alberta. I found myself in a job, again in direct sales. I was peddling garbage bags, but they were special garbage bags. They were biodegradable garbage bags. This was relatively new on the market, hadn't something that not a lot of people were familiar with. So I thought, well, this would be a good thing to sell. I was good at it. I can go door to door, talk to people, no problem, and it was good for the environment. And everyone uses garbage bags. What we didn't know at the time was that it's mostly baloney. Those garbage bags that were made with a mixture of cornstarch that were supposed to help the plastic break apart in the sunlight or when it's in a landfill and thereby help it biodegrade. I guess we didn't know about microplastics back then so much. And regardless of whether that plastic was breaking down quicker with cornstarch or without, we now know that, plastic just isn't the way to be an environmentalist. So that didn't last for too long. I kind of figured out that, this is some kind of scam. I found myself in Edmonton, renting a house with a few young friends of mine. It was basically party central. needed to work, of course. I found myself getting a job at the Radio Shack, which didn't last the weekend until I was scanning the want ads in the newspaper. For you younger listeners and viewers out there, a newspaper is a collection of paper that's usually folded and contains all the news of the day, and it comes out usually daily. They might still do that in some places. I haven't seen or touched a newspaper in a long time myself, so I can't be 100% sure. Anyways, I found this want ad in the classified section where employers would advertise for workers, essentially. Pretty easy concept. And it just simply said Greenpeace, 439-4050. I was intrigued. I thought, well, I'd heard of Greenpeace. I know they're an environmental organization. I'm going to give them a call. And it turned out they were looking for fundraisers to go door to door. I thought, wow, this is perfect. I've got all this door to door sales experience, and I also want to work for an environmental group and do some good work. So I said, yeah, I'm your man. I'm totally down for this job. So they hired me right away, and I was off to the races. I did quite well. One of their better canvassers, if I might say. Just hitting the doors, asking people, hey, we got this stuff going on in the environment. Animals are in danger. The forests are getting cut down. Trouble with the ozone layer. The planet's heating up. There's chemicals in our food, etc., etc. If you could spare $5, $10, $20, $100, that would be great. I'll be on my way. I'll leave you with some literature, maybe a calendar, and away we go. So that was kind of the shtick, and I did that for quite a while until I come across a little bit of a moral conundrum where I had discovered and uncovered that our boss at the local Edmonton Greenpeace office was embezzling money that we were raising every day. Essentially, he was cooking the books, writing them in pencil and then redoing them and pocketing cash at the end of every night, and then being generous, inviting, buying friendship from the crew, buying drinks and food and et cetera, et cetera. So it was fairly obvious what was happening. And I exposed that to the head bosses in Toronto, wrote them a nice long letter. And one night coming back from canvassing, I was called into the office and told that there was a phone call. I pick up the phone and say hello. And the person on the other end says, "This is God." I was a little bit taken back. I thought, wow, it's pretty ballsy for someone to call themselves God, but we'll see where that goes. And it turns out it was the executive director of Greenpeace Canada who wanted to talk about this issue. And after we discussed the details that I'd written out in the letter, he essentially boiled it down to the fact that management has perks and that there's nothing wrong, no harm, no foul, and nothing to talk about further. So I knew that was baloney, and my course of action was just to leave that organization at that time. So this is, I guess still 1990. Shortly thereafter, I ended up working for the Western Canada Wilderness Committee, who had just opened up an office in Edmonton in the same building as the Eco City Society, the old, now demolished, graphic arts building on the southwest corner of 95th Street and Jasper Avenue in Edmonton. A local businessman, David Boroditsky, and his brother, I believe, were leasing that building, renting that building, or maybe they owned it, I don't know. And they had allowed Eco City Society to set up shop in there, which was essentially Tuka Gomberg and Angela Bischoff and all the wonderful campaigns and people that they brought together in Edmonton in the early 1990s. There was a gig space in there. Apparently they did a lot of punk rock shows. It was Edmonton's first smoke-free venue, which was quite radical, 33, 34 years ago. It's pretty cool. And they also housed the Wilderness Committee, Western Canada Wilderness Committee. It was opened up by Gray Jones, who still lives in Edmonton, no longer with the Wilderness Committee. He's retired now. A biologist by training and a forest campaigner by trade. So it was interesting working with him and setting up his Canvas organization. Didn't last too long though. I guess I was getting itchy feet. And soon thereafter, I was on the road again. This time I headed to Regina and joined back up with Greenpeace actually, because they were opening up a seasonal regional office there. Some of my pals and colleagues from the Edmonton office were joining in on that endeavor, and I thought, well, it's not that same guy that's embezzling the money, and I know how to do the job. Sounds like fun, so I went out there and did that. There was 7 of us in this core group, 6 or 7 of us. Let's see if I can remember them all. Tracy, Marnie, Amanda, Tanya, Mike, Jason, and myself. All 7 of us crammed together, living together, 7 to a 1-bedroom apartment, working together every day, partying together every day. We formed some close bonds, and we became known to each other as the Party Hippos. Kind of silly, but we were all young, like 20-somethings, kids. Worked there for about a month, and then with my paychecks, made my way east, stopped in Winnipeg. Didn't last long in Winnipeg at the Greenpeace office because someone came into the office and announced that they had a ticket, a one-way airline ticket to Toronto, if anybody was interested. Well, as it turns out, I was on my way. I was going to make my way out there anyway. So I thought, well, that's a free trip. I'll take it. And back then, it was very easy to transfer ownership of airline tickets. There wasn't a huge amount of big deal or security regarding that. So off to Toronto I went, trying to recount all the dates and times, 91, 92, 1990. It gets a little bit fuzzy in some of those places in the transitions. Hadn't told the story in a long time. At any rate, in 1991, I guess I'm still with Greenpeace at the time, in the fall, and it was the 20th anniversary of the Greenpeace organization. Them having launched in 1971. 1971. Same year I was born. So 1991, I guess, is their 20th anniversary. A bunch of us travel out to Vancouver, where Greenpeace organization began. There's a giant benefit concert out there. Chilliwack played and some others. It's hard to really remember entirely. Again, we were young, so there was some frivolity happening, and I really felt a connection to that organization. And in fact, well, in Vancouver, we stumbled across a bookstore. It was called the Three Sisters Bookstore. Cute little thing, maybe down on Commercial Drive or in Granville or someplace cool in Vancouver. And there was three copies of this book on the shelf, and obviously I picked up one of them. Very interesting read, and it really brought me into the organization, not only the history of it, but the mindset around it, and the level of commitment to activism that these early Greenpeace activists displayed and had, and most especially moving. Of course, written by Robert Hunter. His accounts, of course, very moving, very good writer. But also especially moving were the accounts of him together with Paul Watson, who currently, as of this date, September 5th, 2024, Paul Watson is in jail in Denmark. He was picked off in Greenland on a extradition order from Japan for some alleged shenanigans that he may or may not have partaken in with regards to the Japanese whaling fleet. So that was very inspiring situation. And then when I find myself out in Toronto sometime later, I guess the next spring, I was staying at the Greenpeace office. They had an office on Spadina Drive, up on the 4th floor, I believe, and they were kind enough to let me crash on the couch while I was canvassing there. And one morning or one afternoon before we went out canvassing, they had a guest speaker come in, and it was none other than Bob Hunter. So this is 21, 22 years later since their adventures out in the North Pacific Ocean, sailing into a nuclear test zone in Alaska. That was their maiden voyage. And after a couple of trips trying to stop nuclear testing, they branched out into saving the whales and became an international phenomenon. And the rest is history, as they say. But regardless of that, I was quite taken aback by meeting Bob Hunter at the time. He was on City TV. He did a program on there, a breakfast show, I think, or a morning show. And he came to speak. So afterwards, I'd mentioned that I had a copy of his book and I really liked it, and if he wouldn't mind signing a copy of that book for me. He said, sure, just give me a call and we can connect. So I'd called my friend back in Edmonton who dug that book out of storage for me and sent it to Toronto, and I called him up and we met down at the Bev on Queen Street. And the reason why I remember that is he was very nice to sign this book for me with the most memorable quote that I still hold to this day: "Don't despair, the worst is yet to come." Now, why was I in despair? Because for a year and a half, I was all the way down the environmental rabbit hole, if you will. I'd read every little bit of information I could possibly come by through Greenpeace and other organizations and books and news reports. And this is before the internet, so it wasn't just me sitting at home or on my phone trying to do all this stuff. A lot of the time at the library, learning about all these different things and learning about the history of resistance to that. Not only the activism to protect the environment, but it also tied in with other activism going back before that. Obviously, in the United States, the big anti-war movement, civil rights movement, and then connecting into labor movements, and again, back in history, the women's right to vote movement. It just goes on and on and on. So as I'm growing, as I'm learning about activism and about the world, which I didn't really have a lot of opportunity to learn about growing up. We weren't a political family. In fact, there was kind of a running rule to things that you don't discuss amongst in crowds or at a dinner party, if you will, are politics and religion. So there wasn't a lot of talk about politics or religion in my household. And it was interesting to discover all these things and learn about the world and to feel like I had a place in it, and I had an opportunity to make an impact, if you will. Here I was sitting down and having beer with a guy who was a group of other ragtag individuals. I mean, they just had the temerity to sail a boat, a chartered fishing boat, Phyllis Cormac it was called, charter that boat into a nuclear testing zone with the idea that they do that, they're bearing witness to the tragedy of nuclear weapons testing, but they're also hoping that with their presence there, they won't be able to blow up that bomb because they wouldn't want to kill these innocent people. So that was the premise. Essentially taking direct action, bearing witness, which was a principle that they took from the Quaker movement. In the United States, there was Quakers that were involved with the early Greenpeace group. And then taking non-violent direct action. So putting their bodies on the line, taking a direct action, but doing so non-violently. Again, working on the principles as passed down through Martin Luther King Jr. and previously before that Gandhi and other great movers and activists throughout the ages. Yeah, so that was exciting, getting to meet Bob Hunter and learning about that activism. At the time, I think the big bit of Greenpeace activism that was happening was in protest of the closing down of the cod fishery, I believe, on the East Coast. And probably also that tied in somehow to the issue of sealing, also on the West Coast or on the East Coast. So this story goes that a lot of the sealers and the fishers would say the seals they eat a lot of fish, so we got to kill the seals. But also we had to kill the seals to get the fur from the seals, because the baby seals, they've got really nice fur, and it's worth a lot of money. So that was a lot of activism around that, which again still stemmed from the early days of activism. Here's Bob Hunter and Paul Watson, and in front of a sealing ship, or an icebreaker for a sealing ship, trying to get in its way and just stop production on that situation. Now Paul Watson, as some of you know, he took it a little bit step further than nonviolent direct action. In fact, he was expelled from the organization because he had taken a stack of pelts, fresh pelts, that was sitting on the ice waiting to be loaded onto the ship. And I think the story goes that he just pushed them into the ocean. And that was, I guess, a little bit too much. And some people thought, well, that's a little bit too confrontational, and therefore we don't want you in our organization. And he went on to found the Sea Shepherds, and now the Captain Paul Watson Foundation, heading up what's called Neptune's Navy. But like I said, he's sadly in jail right now, and Bob Hunter passed, 20, I guess a good 20 years ago now, in Toronto. I was in Toronto at the time in the early 2000s when he did pass. I'd gone to a memorial service for him, and had the great pleasure in that sad time to meet Captain Paul Watson. So that was kind of exciting. So the activism, it was a fun thing. We did some things with Greenpeace, and then back in Edmonton, we did some. We couldn't really compel the Greenpeace organization, even though we're in Alberta. It's the home of the tar sands. We had Alpac being built, Alberta Pacific. It was the largest single line craft bleach pulp mill in the world being constructed. We had under construction the Swan Hills Hazardous Waste Treatment Center, which again is in the news this week, first week of September 2024, because I guess for years it's been operating without proper mercury monitoring of all the things. So big oil and gas problems. We had the hazardous waste problem, and of course the deforestry, the clear cutting issue, which was a huge issue in the early 1990s, and in fact it would lead to my first arrest as an environmentalist in 1993 out in Clayoquot Sound. But despite all these things, we couldn't compel, we couldn't encourage, or we couldn't persuade, if you will, a Greenpeace organization to come and do some direct actions in Alberta, really turn up the heat. So we started our own organization called the Concerned Citizens, and with the help of aforementioned David Boroditsky at the Rumpus Room building, Graphics Arts building, where EcoCity was located. Interestingly, the Graphics Arts building housed one of the early adopters of top-end graphics arts technology, computer technology. At the time, it just blew our minds, the stuff that David was doing with his computer and his software. So he happily volunteered to do all of our posters and pamphlets and materials as such, and that was nice. And we did little pickets with signs. We picketed the Remembrance Day ceremonies, of all things. It was kind of dumb. Our first little protest, there was 3 of us, myself, James, JR, and another young woman, I can't remember her name. There's 3 of us. We went downtown Churchill Square to protest Remembrance Day because, we needed to protect the earth that they fought to die for, I guess was the premise. But there was no Remembrance Day ceremony downtown. It was actually at the Butterdome. We didn't even have the sense to properly research where we should be that day doing our protest. We got better over time. There was the Silly Summer Parade on Canada Day, which was going down White Avenue. It was quite a big parade, lots of people lining both sides of the street, and here was us, like maybe a dozen activists with our homemade banner flag. It was a Canadian flag, but instead of a maple leaf in the middle, it was a red stump. And we burst onto the parade and walked counter to the direction that it was coming. So we're on the other side walking counter, and then we had volunteers handing out pamphlets to onlookers on both sides of the street. We didn't make it far. I'd have to consult with Brent Toma, who was with us on that day, how far we did make it. But the police, they ushered us off the street. I don't think anyone was arrested, but they probably took our banner. I can't remember. And then we started getting into painting banners and hanging them off of walk bridges and different overpass bridges throughout the city. And I guess the climax of that effort came when we constructed a 3x3, so it's like 9 hospital sheets sewed together and painted. I think it was just simply stop clear cutting was our slogan on there, and we unfurled that banner off the side of the high level bridge in Edmonton, facing downtown. So it was fairly spectacular, and it made a good picture, and it made it into the news. And that was actually the morning. I'd mentioned James Jr. His first child, him and his wife's first child, was born on that morning, which was kind of fun, kind of interesting. So out of those early Greenpeace days, we got a lot of friendships that still last to this day. I'm still friends with quite a lot of those folks. Some have passed on, unfortunately. Gord Adam and Larry Sieniak, Karen Balgalis, may they all rest in peace. Ted, I can't remember Ted's last name, I'm sorry, but also rest in peace. At any rate, there was a lot of activism on those early years, and like I said, it was in a response to what was happening in the world, and trying to get a hold on that, and trying to find my place in the world, and try and find something that had meaning. So I know that there's a lot of people out there that are trying to find that meaning in their life. Like, that's something that's important for them. And, or maybe they or you just feel compelled to be involved with your community, or to advocate for somebody, or to do something a little bit different. Now, maybe that's taking extra precautions with regards to COVID, or maybe you're going that extra mile for the environment, and you cycle and recycle, and you're into solar, and you do things and you advocate, or you eat local, or what have you. Or maybe you're just involved with your local school council, your local community league, right? Any and all of these things that people are doing in their community with each other to improve things is a form of advocacy, and activism. So I hope that you're not shy about being an activist, and I hope that you can embrace that, and I hope that you find an opportunity to express your activism in your daily life and continue to try and help make the world a better place. Lord knows we could certainly use it. I'm looking at it from a perspective of been there, done that. So it's a little bit of a burnout situation for myself. And I haven't been really super active these last couple of years, but I always try and at least I'm always trying to do something. So with my work, the last work that I had with a nonprofit charitable organization here in the city, doing work around poverty and homelessness and this type of thing. I worked for the city of Edmonton as a bus driver, and I felt very much that was in line with my activist principles. I've had run my own activist media organization called Boiling Frog. Did that for a number of years. Spreading awareness about different issues and different ways that we can tackle those issues, or solve these issues, or work on them together. So that involved a lot of film screenings and film festivals, and producing short films and long films and documentaries and podcasts even. Interestingly enough, this isn't my first rodeo. I was part of a first wave of podcasters back in the early 2000s. I don't know if maybe 2005, somewhere in there, with my first podcast called Reclaiming Independence. I think we broadcast, or we put that out in a 4-part podcast. No longer available, unfortunately, at rabble.ca. And later, I produced a several episode podcast called The Greentown Times out of Craik, Saskatchewan, where I was living when when you were conceived and when you were born. So it kind of takes me to that point. That was in 2010, and I skipped ahead from about 1992. So we're missing, what's the math on that? About 18 years of activism and different fun things that happened between then. Things that were happening in the macro world at that time around activism. I can remember, I had mentioned some of the big things like acid rain and ozone depletion, deforestation. There was the Rio Summit, 1992. So it was a big environmental summit. That was when the nations of the world came together and pledged to solve all of our environmental problems. I believe that it is considered the first first Council of Parties meeting for the United Nations Forum on Climate Change, 1992. We needed to tackle this issue. I could have my details wrong on that, but at any rate, it was a long time ago. Something that came up before I even became an environmentalist, there was the Hagersville tire fire in Ontario, where we learned about PCBs from the incineration, from the burning of tires that happened over weeks and weeks and weeks. Because it's almost impossible to put out a tire fire. That burned for a long period of time, putting a lot of contaminants into the environment. So as I learned about these things, it compelled me to want to get involved and want to change things. 1991, we had the first Gulf War, and that was very impactful. I grew up as a little kid still in the Cold War, and that meant that the USSR and the United States were two opposing superpowers. We had the dual superpowers in the world, and they were both armed to the top with nuclear weapons, and the world was divided along those lines: capitalism and communism. And towards the end of the 1980s, communism fell, if you will, with the agreements between Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev, and Reagan asking him famously to tear down that wall. So that happened. Tying it today, I think there was an agreement that they would dismantle the USSR, essentially tear down the Iron Curtain, and in exchange for that, the West would agree not to expand NATO close to Russia. That agreement hasn't really worked out that well, as we've been on the brink, if not actively in the World War III for a couple of years now, since Russia invaded Ukraine in response to Ukraine and the United States and NATO essentially goading them into it. That's neither here nor there for now. We are talking about activism. I think that's going to be close to the end of my first episode. I don't know if I've touched on it all. Let's see. We got some protests. We got some rallies. We got some banner hangings. We dropped a giant banner off the high level. We did a lot of stuff that I guess could be considered like some nonviolent activism. We hadn't yet locked ourselves to anything. But we did during one action. We had a funeral for the forests in protest of Alberta Pacific, or ALPAC, as was known, and we wanted them to shut down ALPAC. We didn't want to have the largest single-line craft bleach pulp mill in the world in our province, decimating our northern boreal forests and all the wonderful biodiversity therein it contains. So we cooked up a funeral. There was a good 100 of us on Jasper Ave marching to the ALPAC office on the southwest corner of 109th and Jasper, and we had our service out on the sidewalk, and some eulogies were read. It was very beautiful. And then a bunch of us, we just spontaneously decided, well, let's go up to the ALPAC office and occupy their office with the demand that they shut down their operation. So, this is early 1990s, right? Like, there wasn't even, I don't think there was even a security guard for that building that was watching us. There wasn't even any police for our big crowd outside this building. So we very easily went inside the building and got into the elevator and went up to the designated floor where their office was, and had our coffin with our symbolic tree, our Christmas tree that was inside this coffin with some flowers on top of it. And a good dozen or more of us are inside this office. And, we're singing songs and chanting, and we told them, we're here and we're occupying your office, and we demand that you shut down operations and pledge to not deforest our province of Alberta. This, of course, caught them by surprise and made the receptionist very, very uncomfortable. There was a lot of hushed talking to and fro and wondering what to do, and they asked us to leave, and we weren't leaving. They said, well, we're going to call the police. And then we're kind of shocked. We didn't know what to do. So, and I was videotaping. This was my very first opportunity to be a video producer, a cameraman as well. So I'm going around and I'm asking everybody, including Tucker Gomberg, who was running for a city council position at that time. So this would have been 1992. And I'm asking everybody, hey, you want to get arrested today? Are you looking forward to getting arrested? And nobody wanted to get arrested. And I was even surprised that Tucker didn't want to get arrested, because he was generally not shy about that. But with his current campaign to be city councilor, he deemed maybe it wasn't the best day to get arrested. Besides, he'd probably deduced that we weren't that well organized. We didn't even have legal support set up or anything. So it just wasn't that well planned. And then the police came, and they said, well, you got to leave or we're going to arrest you. So we all left, and it was peaceful. But we were successful, I have to say, because, well, not entirely successful. They shut down their operations in Edmonton. So Alpac closed up their office in downtown Edmonton and moved their headquarters up to Athabasca. And that was basically the end of that action against Alpac. And we had another wonderful little action that we did at Churchill Square. This one, there was people there, and we were protesting, I think it was an expansion or something to do with the Genesee coal-fired power plant just west of the city of Edmonton, which recently, this year, I think, burnt its last little bit of coal, finally. So this is like 30-some years later, it stops finally burning coal and now exclusively burns natural gas to create electricity, which at the time, we were all told, hey, if we can convert to natural gas, it's way cleaner, it's, better than coal, it doesn't pollute and everything, plus it's, it's natural, so, it's got to be good. We don't find out until decades later, really, that natural gas is no better than coal or oil or other fossil fuels that we use to heat our homes and generate electricity, because obviously there's a lot of environmental contamination in producing this material, drilling for it, and piping it and processing it and distributing it, etc. But the burning of it, of course, it releases methane, and that goes into the atmosphere. It's I think it's 10 or 100 times stronger than CO2. Very potent greenhouse gas, and we're basically duped. So, just to get back to that action, we were protesting Genesee coal-fired power plant, and we constructed a miniature Genesee power plant. Brent Thoma, actually, I think he made the power plant. It had a little conveyor belt on it, so it was conveying coal, and it's like painted sponges or something, painted black. So, and I was sitting inside this power plant and conveying all this coal into the power plant. We had a little smokestack, and we had some dry ice inside, and so it would be smoking and the coal would be coming in. It was quite an impressive little prop that I got to sit in and play with. Let's see what other kind of actions. Oh, and then a fun little action that we did was basically a party in 1992. It was to come as your favorite environmental disaster, which was a challenging ask for people, but they came out, and that was about the peak of it. 1992, the peak of my early activism years. The next year, I would. That was the peak of my early Greenpeace activism years. But the next summer of 1993, I'd alluded to this already. I had gone to Clayoquot Sound and participated in the largest mass arrest in Canadian history. At the time, more than 900 people were arrested that summer in protection of the old growth forest in Clayoquot Sound. It was quite amazing. Many of you will remember that, and I certainly do. It was fantastic time. I was arrested. That was my first arrest as an activist, and I will tell you all about that on the next episode. So I want to thank you for listening. Max, I hope that you're still taking this in. This is a great way for you to absorb stories that maybe you've heard snippets of, or maybe you didn't know that about me at all. I remember when I was telling you that other story about how I was assaulted, had my life threatened in Toronto, that activist meeting. You had remarked that I should make a podcast, and I thought, wow, that's a great idea. Yeah, I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna make a podcast. Now here we are, 14 months later. A lot of procrastinating, a lot of thinking about how this is gonna go, what I'm gonna talk about, and then just straight up procrastination. So I finally got it started. Here we are. First episode, Confessions of a Gen X Activist. Gen Xtivist. I don't know. Confessions of a burnt out douchebag. Maybe for the next podcast, I'll have a little bit more proper of an appearance for you, and we'll make the background maybe a little bit different or a little bit better. We'll work on stuff. I'm just working through some of the details. At any rate, now I am rambling, and I bid you adieu.